My name is Sarah Hendrickx. I'm a late diagnosed adult with a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. I'm also a specialist, consultant, trainer, conference speaker and author in autistic spectrum conditions. I'm the partner of a man with Asperger's syndrome, the mother of a son with Asperger's syndrome, and there are plenty of other people in my family that are yet undiagnosed or in denial. I work with families, I work with couples, I work with individuals, I do in workplace work, assessments, mediation, I do criminal justice work, I run projects in education, I'm a contract hub for the Autism Education Trust post-16 training programme, sit on a couple of boards for the National Autistic Society, and basically live a very autistic life. I think obviously there are massive benefits in asking staff to promote happiness and well-being, because I think if we're focusing on happiness, the culture that we're developing is one of positivity. So rather than people feeling that it's all about challenging behaviour, all about them doing something wrong or something unacceptable, we're actually just treating people like human beings, because everybody deserves a right to be happy and to be okay in their lives. And I think sometimes in some settings, it's often about just getting through the day, helping the person to get through their day. And actually it feels that sometimes happiness and well-being are a kind of luxury. They're a bit of an add-on that we either don't have the time for, the resources for, or the energy for. But maybe if we were to kind of put that higher up the agenda, then what we might see is it's just a slight shift in focus, that actually if our goal is for this person to be having a good time rather than just an acceptable time, maybe we up our game a bit. Maybe the whole culture of the organisation feels more positive. Maybe staff feel a bit more positive because they're looking for good rather than looking to knock out the negative, if you like, if that makes sense. I think it's taken us a long time to focus on these kind of things, on happiness, on well-being, despite this knowledge of autism for many, many decades. I think, first of all, the focus has been very medical. It's been very clinical. It's been about defining what is autism, how does it affect people. It's been theoretical. It's been about neuroscience, all of those kind of nuts and bolts. And I think more recently, what we're seeing, and this is really recent, even in the last sort of 10 years or so, I think what we're actually starting to see is that it's about the sort of social model, it's about acceptance, it's about diversity. I think for many years it was about fixing autistic people, it was about normalising, it was about what can we do to help this person to fit into our society. And actually now I think we're starting to go, you know what, this is a community of its own, it's got its own voice, you're fine as you are, we accept you as you are, and actually now, you do have feelings, you do have emotions, because I think still, and this is something I come across in my work, you hear people saying, well, people with autism don't have any emotions, purely because perhaps we can't see those emotions in the facial effects if a person doesn't express themselves in that kind of way. And I think we are starting to see there's a lot of work in relationships. You see programs like the Undateables, and I know Bild's work around helping people with autism and learning disabilities in terms of relationships. And again, these feels a bit like luxuries now, whereas they're not. They're actually just basic facets of what any human being should expect from their lives. But in a way, I feel that sometimes people with autism, we've kind of not really felt that those almost applied. You don't need friends, you don't need relationships, you don't need, fulfillment and all of those kind of things. I mean, interestingly, a lot of work that I've been involved in is around kind of gender identity, around sexuality, around parents who are on the autistic spectrum. It's almost like, these groups obviously all existed, these issues were out there. But we didn't really deal with that because we were doing the basics. We were just trying to make you like a normal person. We were just trying to get you through school or get you through the day. And now we're seeing actually a whole community of people that are defining their own rights a bit more and saying, no, sod you, I want a relationship and I want it on my terms. And it might not be conventional and it might not fit the kind of mould as it were for neurotypical people, but it's okay. So I think it's really exciting what we're doing now in autism. It's a start and there's a long way to go, but I think there's a huge shift in focus and a much bigger voice for people with autism just saying it's not good enough. I deserve the same as everybody else, and that's right as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, it's difficult to generalise because every child is an individual, every family is an individual. But actually, I think there are some things that we can think about when we're thinking about how parents can enhance the child's well-being and self-esteem. It's all about acceptance. It's all about being positive about the diagnosis. It's all about allowing this person to be who they are. I speak as a late diagnosed person who didn't have any of that, and I also speak as a mother of an 18-year-old son who does have Asperger's syndrome. And actually I have a theory that, and I don't know whether this is true or not, that my son is perhaps less negatively impacted by his autism, his Asperger's, because actually he was born into a quirky family and he was a quirky kid, and all of the things that he required were accepted to a degree, and we would just, nobody said, no, it doesn't matter where the ketchup is on your plate. If he needed it in that exact spot, then that's where he got it. Yeah. And I think that actually that sort of, it doesn't matter kind of approach that I think some parents, perhaps lacking their understanding of the autism itself, perhaps not wanting to have this feeling of sort of playing up to the routines or the need for the predictability. Actually what they end up doing is perhaps diminishing that child's sort of belief that where the ketchup is extremely important to me, and actually perhaps we should just value some of that, and that's not to say that we should allow every child to do what they like. It's not that we should restrict them and say, oh my God, we have to keep these routines and we must never change them. We must challenge, we must embrace change, we must teach the person how to manage their anxieties, to deal with the real world, because that's where they're going to be. But we do it in a way that actually makes that person feel good about themselves, rather than feeling that they're kind of failing as they are, which was certainly my experience and many people that I know, is a sense that you're just not quite a right human being. You're a bit rubbish at being a human being because you say weird things and you do weird kind of stuff. And I think the biggest thing you can do is learn as much as you can about autism. Find out that actually your child is not just being difficult, that they're just getting through the world in the way they need to. Ask them, why is it so important that the ketchup goes there? Tell me, teach me. You encourage their self-awareness about what matters to them and why it matters to them and how you might adapt that to become more flexible. But you also increase your understanding. And I think it was Lorna Wing that said, throw out what you know and start again. And I think if you're not an autistic parent, if you're a neurotypical parent, then you have to almost kind of go, okay, tell me about your world, because it's not the same as mine. Mine doesn't matter about ketchup, but yours does. And I think it's just that openness and kind of willingness. I think the other thing that happens that I see a lot is that a lot of parents identify with some of these autistic traits. It's a genetic condition, largely. There's a lot of autism in lots of families. But often the parents, whilst wanting the child to accept it, the parents give the message that actually they don't want the finger pointed at them. And I often wonder what that feels like for a child who's living in a family, who's got a parent that's saying, well, you have autism, and I'm a little bit like you, but I don't have autism. And it might just be subtle and it might not be conscious, but there is a kind of message there that kind of says, it's not all right to have autism. And how is that ever going to help anyone feel good about themselves? Genuinely, I mean, as a very big generalisation, I think that parents best, it's just about acceptance. Just let this person be who they are and work from that point onwards into making them as independent as possible. The kind of strategies that I see in schools or adult settings that seem to enhance well-being, and part of this is kind of my own kind of theories as well, and things that I do. I work a lot in FE colleges with young people, kind of coming to terms with diagnosis and things. Is the key is awareness of your own autism. That's got to be the starting point. What I see, particularly in a lot of young people, teenagers, sometimes adults, perhaps less so, is not necessarily wanting to identify with this thing, this diagnosis, this autism thing, which perhaps you perceive as the cause of all of your troubles. It's the reason you don't make friends. It's the reason that you struggle. It's the reason that you're overwhelmed. It's the reason you don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And I think it's very hard, particularly when you're a teenager, to actually get your head around the fact that this isn't going away. It's part of who you are. And how do you like it? And for me, a big part of the work that I do, and I think is very important, is actually teaching people enough about it, allowing them to put it in perspective, allowing them to see other people with autism talking positively, to meet other people with autism, to find their own tribe, as it were, which once they do so, I've seen enormous changes in people. It's just a room full of people that let you kind of be who you are. And I think it's very core. I think sometimes a lot of the efforts that we make to enhance well-being kind of miss the point unless we've done the core. And the core is, I kind of have to, if not like, but at least accept that this is me. Good and bad, this is who I am, it's not going to disappear, so I might as well get used to it. And that sounds rather pragmatic and rather bleak, and I'll never make a counsellor, but actually I find that a lot of young people with autism quite like that. They quite like the honesty, they quite like that's the way it's going to be, what are we going to do about it? And working in a much more kind of cognitive behavioural sort of approach, where we look at individual problems that cause anxiety or stress or difficulties, we pick them apart, and we kind of try and find new ways to kind of move them onwards. So it's acceptance of self, it's acceptance of autism. The more you know about autism, the more you can fit yourself into this puzzle and go, oh yeah, it's not just me who does that. There's a whole bunch of people out there who do that. And that in itself, I think, for a lot of people makes them feel a lot less isolated. Because I think a lot of people who are not in this kind of autism culture just think, I'm the only idiot that gets this wrong. I'm the only person that's screwing up. Everybody else is sorted. They also don't know that the general neurotypical population is also full of anxiety, is also having all sorts of problems and difficulties and not getting on with people and struggling, but they hide it so well that a lot of people with autism that I meet just think everyone else is absolutely 100% fine all of the time, and it's just me. And I think that, as a concept, is really useful to know. I think that practitioners should reveal little bits about themselves to actually give this person some new data to kind of reflect upon, that actually I'm really frightened of doing that, or I'm really bad at doing that, or I get really anxious when I'm doing that. I mean, obviously we have to be careful around boundaries and things, but if we're too professional, if we're too distant, this person never gets any data. Remembering that a lot of people with autism don't have peer groups, they don't have friends. Who are they going to ask? How do they find out that other people have their struggles too? They can't. There is no one. There is no data source. So maybe the professional has to be that person. Maybe the family has to be that person where you're actively saying, this really frightens me, this makes me scared. Because I think a lot of people with autism think the rest of the world is fine. And no one's fine. Everybody's winging it. And I think that's really useful for kind of putting that in perspective. So I think in terms of approaches, it's not necessarily a kind of solid program, but it's the concepts of understanding who you are, learning about it, and getting a broader perspective of the world to actually think, well, actually, I'm not doing so bad, all things considered. And it's a much more kind of organic process, I think, in helping or things like well-being and happiness. We don't just go in, run a program and you come out happy. It's a much more kind of low level, and actually maybe you wake up one day and you don't feel quite as bad as you did the day before, and that's all we're looking for, kind of gradual sort of changes. Books, resources, obviously hundreds of them coming out all of the time, and I think they're very, very personal in terms of what you use. There's a lot of people on the autistic spectrum blogging that are doing some very useful stuff. And again, it's about having a solidarity, having a feeling of, I do that too, which can be very useful if you're feeling that you're an isolated person or you're the only person that experiences these things. I think YouTube, things like Wrong Planet are really useful for watching videos of other people with autism talking about their experiences, reading other comments, contributing. So kind of getting involved in the community. I find that really helpful, and that really aids a lot of people into just naturally feeling just that little bit like, whew, it's not me. It's a thing. It's fine. We move on. Finding strategies, that kind of stuff. One of the books that I use, a little book, it's called Glimpses of Asperger's, and it's written by a woman called Dr. Mari Harder. And Mari has Asperger's herself, and she is a professor at the University of Brighton. And it's a little orange book about this size. It only costs about £5 or something. And every page, it's kind of designed for young people and adults, and every page is some kind of very simple line diagrams and just a couple of sentences. So it's not lots of text. And every page has a different aspect of life with Asperger's. And some of the more subtle stuff stuff. So it'll be like a little scenario where when one person is saying something, the other person is thinking, goodness, how rude. And it's very relatable, not much reading, it's very visual. And at the bottom, you can kind of write whether you find this particular aspect relevant to you or not. I send young people away with it. And typically I work in a college with young people doing a project, and I say, tell me about your Asperger's, and they say, well, I don't really have very much. I'm terribly mild. All the others, they've got loads, but me, hardly any. They come back a week later with this book and they say, I've got bloody loads of it. And actually, I quite like it. And just by having that kind of slightly broader perspective of, oh, that's me, oh, that's me, oh, this is a thing. It's put in perspective, and you start seeing young people take a bit of ownership of it and actually start to revel in it a little bit and go, yeah, I do that thing, and it's quite funny, and that's incredibly kind of positive. It also is useful for kind of parents and family members, because sometimes I've had young people who come back and go, no, I don't do any of this at all. And yet, if you ask their parent to go through the book, the parent will go, well, actually, you do. So again, sometimes people aren't always aware of how they're coming across, and sometimes that can be a useful dialogue to sit down and say, well, yeah, that is you. Why is that? It just opens a dialogue. Chris Mitchell, writing books on mindfulness. I think mindfulness is another big area that people are talking about now in autism, just a kind of sense of being okay in the moment, in a world which makes you feel stressed and anxious for every single minute of every day, that some of those kind of things might be kind of useful tools that a lot of people can access. People with learning disabilities, can access those kind of techniques. It's kind of simple. It doesn't, require anything kind of complicated. Another big favourite of mine, and this is somebody who I never hear talked about, is a woman called Valerie Gauss, Gaus, and she's written a couple of books. I think she's from America, one of which is called Living Well on the Spectrum. And it's and her other book is adults cognitive behavioural therapy for adults with Asperger's. The concepts, the techniques, the way she writes about things. The Living Well on the Spectrum book is a workbook. It teaches you to kind of examine. It's that very CBT kind of method. What's causing me a problem? How else could I think about this? What kind of strategies might I put in place? What kind of alternatives can I gather? Let's test it out. Did it work? If it did work, great. If it didn't work, back to the drawing board. So it's really practical. It's really sensible. It's written in a very respectful and intelligent way and makes sense of all of those kind of things. So those are my favourite resources. And of course, everything written by me.